44 years ago, on a warm Friday evening in the American Midwest, over 1,600 people walked into a hotel lobby to dance, to laugh, and to simply enjoy being alive. They had no reason to think anything could go wrong. The building was brand new. Every professional responsible for its construction had reviewed it and signed off. The city was proud of it. And yet, before that night was over, people went in and did not come back out. What happened in that lobby was not an accident in the way most people understand accidents. It was the slow, quiet accumulation of overlooked details, unanswered questions, and decisions made in haste that nobody went back to check. Kansas City, in the summer of 1981, was a city riding a genuine wave of confidence. For years, like so many American cities, it had struggled with a decaying downtown, an economy that felt stuck, and a sense that the best days might be behind it. But in the late 1970s, something changed. The Hallmark Cards Company, whose headquarters had sat in Kansas City since the early part of the century, decided to invest massively in the area surrounding its offices. What had become a rundown stretch of warehouses and crumbling lots was transformed into what planners called a city within a city, a new commercial and cultural complex named Crown Center. The Hyatt Regency Hotel was designed to be the crown jewel of that entire vision. 40 stories tall, 504 feet, rising above the Missouri skyline, it was the tallest building in the entire state when it opened its doors on the first day of July, 1980. Kansas City had not seen anything like it. The moment guests stepped through the entrance, the lobby stopped them in their tracks. A 5-story open atrium, glass elevators moving silently up the walls, and 3 suspended walkways floating above the crowd like bridges in midair. From the day it opened, people came back every Friday for the tea dance, big band music, couples dressed up, laughter filling every corner of that space. On the evening of July 17th, Karen and Eugene Jeter, married just 16 days earlier, were on that dance floor among 1,600 people, entirely unaware they were being filmed. And then, at 7 minutes past 7, a sound cut through the music. Not an explosion, not a crash, just a sharp metallic pop. Then another. And then 1 second of silence before everything changed forever. To understand what happened that evening, you have to go back to where the Hyatt Regency actually came from, because the building carried a problem inside its walls from almost the very beginning. The story starts in 1976, when Crown Center Redevelopment Corporation, the Hallmark subsidiary overseeing the project, began planning the hotel in earnest. The architectural vision was ambitious. A 40-story tower connected to a conference block by a soaring interior atrium, with those 3 elevated walkways suspended in midair providing circulation between floors. The structural engineering contract went to a Texas firm called GC International. A separate company, Haven Steel, was brought in to fabricate and erect the atrium steel, including the walkways themselves. And overseeing the whole project as architect was the firm PB&DML. 3 different companies, each with defined responsibilities, each operating in their own lane. Construction began in the spring of 1978. The late 1970s were not an easy time to be building in America. High inflation, double-digit interest rates, and fierce competition between contractors created enormous pressure to move quickly and cut costs wherever possible. The Kansas City Star would later describe the era as one where notable structures around the country were failing at an alarming rate. The Hartford Civic Center roof had collapsed in 1978. The Kemper Arena roof fell in 1979. These are not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of an industry moving faster than its oversight could keep up with. The Hyatt project was, by the newspaper's own account, fast-tracked. Speed was not just preferred. It was the organizing principle of the entire construction. In October of 1979, before the hotel had even opened its doors, something happened that should have stopped everyone and made them look much more carefully at what they were building. A section of the atrium roof measuring 2,700 square feet collapsed during construction. A connection had failed. Engineers were brought in. The damage was assessed, repairs were made, and the project moved forward. Officials issued assurances that the atrium was safe. What nobody did was commission a thorough review of every other connection in the building. Nobody asked the harder question, which was whether the same kind of failure might be lurking somewhere else in the structure. The roof collapse was treated as an isolated incident rather than a signal. The hotel opened on schedule in July of 1980 to considerable fanfare, and Kansas City celebrated. What the celebrating crowds did not know, and what even many of the professionals involved did not fully appreciate, was that the structural drawings for the walkways had been produced with a significant omission. The original engineering plans from GCE were incomplete in a critical respect. They specified that the walkways would be suspended by steel rods running from the ceiling down through the fourth-floor walkway and continuing down to the second-floor walkway below. But the precise detail of how those rods would connect to the walkway beams, a detail that would turn out to matter enormously, was never fully worked out in the original drawings. That gap was left for someone else to fill during construction, and the way it was filled would cost 114 people their lives. In early 1979, the steel fabricators at Haven Steel were working through the construction drawings when they ran into a practical problem. The original design called for a single continuous rod to run all the way from the ceiling through the fourth-floor walkway and down to the second-floor walkway below. Threading a single rod of that length through two separate floors was complicated and, from the fabricator's point of view, impractical on a fast-moving construction site. Someone at Havens picked up the phone and called GCE to propose a simpler solution. Instead of one long, continuous rod, they suggested using two shorter rods. The first rod would run from the ceiling down to the fourth-floor walkway. A second, separate rod would then run from the fourth-floor walkway down to the second-floor walkway. It seemed reasonable. It would make the job faster and easier. And someone at GCE gave verbal approval. The modified shop drawings were submitted to GCE for formal review and were stamped with the engineering firm's approval in February of 1979. What nobody paused to consider was what this change actually meant for the load the structure would have to carry. In the original single-rod design, the fourth-floor walkway connection only had to bear the weight of the fourth-floor walkway itself. The second-floor walkway hung from the rods independently. With the new two-rod system, the fourth-floor connection now had to carry both walkways. The load on that single connection point had effectively doubled. The engineer who signed off on the modified drawings had no record of ever performing a load calculation for the new configuration. After the collapse, investigators from the National Bureau of Standards searched through GCE's files and found no evidence that any safety factor had ever been calculated for that connection as built. None. The modified walkway system was signed, approved, built, and open to the public without anyone ever verifying whether it could hold the weight it was designed to hold. Two of the key engineers at GCE who had been involved in the original design had already left the company by the time the modification was approved. The institutional memory of what the design was supposed to do and why it had been designed that way was simply gone. Nobody who remained at the firm appears to have gone back to the beginning and asked whether the change was structurally sound. The project moved on. The walkways were built. The hotel opened. And every Friday evening that the tea dance filled that atrium, the building was edging quietly toward the moment it could no longer hold. The most extraordinary finding to emerge from the subsequent investigation was not that the design change made the walkways dangerous. It was the margin by which it made them dangerous. The fourth-floor connection, as actually built, had a tested ultimate capacity of 18.6 kips. The Kansas City Building Code at the time required that connection to be able to bear 40.7 kips. The walkways were carrying more than twice the load the connection could safely handle, and they had been doing so since the day they were installed. Investigators later concluded that the structure would have eventually failed under one-third of the weight of the crowd it held on the night of July 17th. It was not a question of whether they would fail. It was only a question of when. There is something almost unbearable about the simplicity of what was missed. This was not obscure engineering. The calculation that would have revealed the problem was straightforward, the kind of analysis taught in the first year of any structural engineering program. Dozens of trained professionals reviewed those drawings at various stages of the project, including city inspectors whose job it was to check exactly this kind of thing. Not one of them caught it. The Kansas City Star, after the collapse, hired an engineer who identified the fatal flaw within days just by looking at the drawings. It was not hidden. It was not subtle. It was just never checked. The evening of July 17th had been a particularly good one for the tea dance. The crowd was large, the music was strong, and the atrium was filled in every direction with people having exactly the kind of night the hotel had been designed to give them. On the second-floor walkway, Roughly 40 people stood looking down at the dancers below. On the fourth floor walkway, 16 to 20 more had gathered for a higher vantage point. The orchestra, led by bandleader Steve Miller, was in the middle of Duke Ellington's Satin Doll when witnesses first heard it. A sharp popping sound, audible from 30 meters away across the lobby. Then another. And then the fourth floor walkway dropped several inches, paused for one suspended moment as though the building itself had caught its breath, and then fell completely. It landed on the second floor walkway directly beneath it. The second floor walkway, now carrying the weight of both structures and the people on them, lasted less than a second before it too gave way. Both walkways crashed to the lobby floor together. 65 tons of steel, concrete, and glass hit a crowd of people who had no time to move. A diner eating at the revolving restaurant on the 42nd floor said it felt like an explosion. From the street outside, people reported hearing the impact through the walls of the building. Inside the atrium, the dust cloud that rose in the first seconds after the collapse made it almost impossible to see. The music had stopped. The lights had gone out because the power had been cut. And then, as the dust began to settle, the sounds that replaced the music were unlike anything anyone in that lobby had ever heard. The sprinkler system pipes had been severed in the collapse. Water from internal tanks, not connected to any city supply and therefore impossible to shut off, began flooding the atrium floor. Electrical wires hung, sparking in the darkness. Some of the people trapped beneath the debris were not just pinned by steel and concrete. They were in danger of drowning. One man, Mark Williams, had been waiting at the bar when the collapse happened. The impact spread his legs apart and pinned him in that position with both legs pulled from their sockets. He was conscious throughout. He could feel the water rising around his head. He spent the next 9.5 hours trapped in a space not much larger than a suitcase, listening to the sounds of the rescue operation moving closer and then farther away, wondering whether anyone knew he was there. Dr. Joseph Weckerl, Kansas City's recently departed medical director, arrived at the scene within minutes and took command of the medical response. What he found was unlike anything he had encountered before, and he had experienced serious disasters. He described the lobby as a war zone. Electrical wires arcing in the dark, water flooding across the floor, the weight of the debris so enormous that the fire department's most powerful jacks could not move it. He faced a decision that no doctor ever wants to face. With hundreds of people down and limited resources, he had to make real-time judgments about who could be saved and who could not, directing his team toward those who had a chance only if someone reached them immediately. He later said that the only way to function in that environment was to divorce yourself from the feeling that you could help everyone. The fire chief, surveying the rising water and the mass of trapped survivors, realized that the hotel's front doors were acting as a dam. He ordered a bulldozer to break them open. A fire hose was connected to the severed pipes to reduce the flow. Then came an appeal to the broader city. Local construction companies were asked to send whatever they had. They responded without hesitation. Cranes arrived and were maneuvered through the lobby windows to lift sections of debris. Hydraulic jacks, generators, acetylene torches, concrete saws, and jackhammers were brought in by people who had not been asked to pay for any of it and who never submitted a bill afterward. Deputy Fire Chief Arnett Williams described it simply. He said the companies told him to take whatever he wanted and nobody ever asked for an accounting. The rescue operation ran through the night and into the following morning, lasting 14 hours in total. It was one of the largest structural rescue operations ever conducted in the United States up to that point. 29 people were pulled alive from beneath the debris. A surgeon spent 20 minutes amputating one victim's pinned leg with a chainsaw to free them. That victim later died. 31 more bodies were found beneath the final slab of concrete when it was lifted at 7:15 the following morning. Pamela Coffey, 11 years old, the youngest victim of the collapse, had come to the tea dance with her father Gerald. Neither of them survived. The final death toll was 114. 216 more were injured. A helicopter pilot who assisted in the operation that night compared what he saw inside that lobby to the Vietnam War, but in greater numbers. The investigation began almost immediately. The Kansas City Star, unwilling to wait for official findings, hired its own structural engineer, Wayne Lishka, within days of the collapse. Using a telephoto lens because investigators were not yet permitted close access to the debris, Lishka photographed the surviving rod connections. What he saw told him everything he needed to know. The design change, the split from one continuous rod into two shorter rods, was visible in the wreckage. The newspaper identified the fatal modification before any government agency had issued a single finding. The coverage that followed would run for 16 months and win a Pulitzer Prize. It would also put the paper in direct conflict with Kansas City's most powerful institutions, including Hallmark Cards itself, whose subsidiary owned the hotel, and a community that found the relentless scrutiny hard to accept. The National Bureau of Standards, now known as the National Institute of Standards and Technology, launched a full federal investigation. Its lead investigator, Edward Frang, spent months working through the evidence and interviewing everyone involved. His conclusion about the culture surrounding the entire Hyatt project became one of the most quoted assessments in the history of American engineering disasters. He described it as everyone wanting to walk away from responsibility. The drawings had moved between companies without anyone taking clear ownership of the critical details. Design changes had been made verbally and then approved without recalculation. The two engineers who understood the original design had left the firm before the modification was finalized. The city inspectors who should have caught the violation of building code had not. The final report found that the walkways, even in their original configuration, would have failed to meet Kansas City's own building code. The change that Havens proposed and GC approved simply made an already inadequate structure catastrophically worse. In the courts, what Frang had described in professional terms played out with brutal clarity. Every defendant in the civil litigation, including Hallmark Cards, Crown Center Corporation, the architects, the structural engineers, and the contractor, denied all legal liability. Not one party voluntarily accepted responsibility. In 1984, the Missouri Board of Engineers filed formal charges of gross negligence, misconduct, and unprofessional conduct against Jack Gillum, Daniel Duncan, and their firm GC International. By November of that year, all three had been found guilty. Gillum and Duncan lost their engineering licenses. The firm was stripped of its right to practice. No criminal charges were ever filed. Nobody went to prison. More than 300 civil lawsuits were eventually filed, seeking a combined total that approached $3 billion. At least $140 million was actually paid out to victims and their families in judgments and settlements. The largest single award went to Sally Firestone, 34 years old, left a quadriplegic when the second-floor walkway fell beneath her, whose care for the rest of her life would require constant medical support. Asked about it years later, she said she was not bitter. She said she was simply amazed that nobody had discovered the problems before they killed so many people. Donald Hall, the president of Hallmark Cards and the man whose family's company had built the hotel, wrote a letter to his employees the morning after the collapse. He said the past 18 hours had been the darkest of his life and that he found it difficult even to talk about what had happened. The disaster threatened not just the future of the hotel, but the financial stability of Hallmark itself, one of Kansas City's largest employers. The settlement process took years. Meanwhile, the New York Times reported that the city had become deeply and bitterly divided in a way that was rarely seen after a catastrophe of this kind. Victims' families felt abandoned. Rescuers who had worked through the night developed lasting trauma and eventually formed their own informal support group because there was nowhere else to process what they had seen. The Kansas City Star, whose investigative reporting had been essential in establishing what had gone wrong, found itself at odds with the very community it was trying to serve, its relationship with the city strained for years by the relentlessness of its coverage. Karen Jeter was 37 years old. She had been married to Eugene for 16 days. Her son Brent, Wright, was working the loading dock at a department store that evening to earn money for college when he heard something on the radio about an accident at the Hyatt. The details were unclear. He called his mother's number. Nobody answered. He went home that night and went to sleep. The next morning, his father and stepmother, who had also been at the tea dance, sat him down and told him what had happened. He said afterward that it was almost too horrible to believe. Years later, when a national news program aired footage from that evening, he saw his mother and Eugene on camera, dancing and laughing in the atrium just minutes before the collapse. He said it was a really nice thing to know that at least that night, they were living their lives to the fullest. Evelyn Goober was in the atrium when the walkways fell. She watched her husband Joe lift his arms and disappear beneath a wall of debris. She tried to run toward him. The force of the collapse knocked her backward. Joe Goober did not survive. 40 years later, Evelyn told a writer that she still saw Joe in her dreams, walking toward her, and then it was over. Frank Freeman was there that night with his partner Roger Grigsby. Roger did not make it out. Frank spent the next 34 years advocating for a permanent memorial to the victims, and when it was finally dedicated in 2015, he said it had been his dream for all of those years and that he was overcome. Mark Williams, the last survivor pulled from the wreckage, spent his hours beneath the concrete in a position that should have been impossible to survive, listening to rescuers move overhead and calling out to them whenever he heard them close enough. At one point during the effort to free him, a jackhammer came through the concrete directly beside his body. He shouted to them not to run it in again. When rescuers finally reached him, his first emotion was not relief. It was anger that it had taken so long. He later said, with something that sounded almost like dark humor, that the anger was what kept him alive. Among those who survived the physical injuries, the psychological weight of the night proved harder to shake. One survivor refused to leave his house every July 17th for years. Another lit a candle and poured a drink. A woman whose back was broken in the fall bought a new mattress every 3 years because the ache that ran through her spine never fully went away. The Skywalk Memorial Plaza was dedicated on November 12, 2015, in Hospital Hill Park, directly across the street from what had once been the Hyatt Regency Hotel. It took 34 years and the persistent effort of survivors, families, and first responders to make it happen. The memorial is a steel sculpture of two dancers joined together, their forms suggesting both the joy that brought those people to the atrium that Friday evening and the irreversible moment that ended it. A column nearby carries the 114 names of those who died. At the dedication ceremony, Frank Freeman read each name aloud, introducing every victim with a word about who they had been. The hotel still stands. It is called the Sheraton Kansas City Hotel at Crown Center now. The lobby looks largely the same as it did in 1981. The walkways are gone, replaced by a single structure anchored in solid columns that go nowhere near the people standing below. The lobby is quiet on most days. Guests walk through it without knowing. That is exactly what the people they are unknowingly honoring would least want. The Hyatt Regency collapse is studied in every accredited engineering program in the United States today. It sits alongside the Challenger disaster in Chernobyl as one of the foundational case studies in professional ethics, a story used to teach engineers what their responsibility to the public actually means and what the cost of abandoning that responsibility can be. The collapse also changed emergency response in America in ways that are still felt today. The all-hazards approach to disaster management that is now standard for first responders across the country traces part of its development to the lessons learned in that Kansas City lobby. The lessons belong not just to engineers and first responders, however. There are things that ordinary people can know, drawn directly from what happened that night, that carry genuine value. The first is about awareness before anything goes wrong. When you walk into any large public space, a hotel lobby, a concert hall, a sports venue, a shopping atrium, it costs nothing to take 20 seconds to locate the exits nearest to your position. Not the entrance you came through. The nearest exit from exactly where you are standing right now. Emergency management professionals call this situational awareness. And every first responder who has ever worked a structural collapse will tell you that the people who move first and move with purpose are the ones who survive. At the Hyatt, the people on the walkways above had 1 second of warning before everything fell. 20 seconds of advanced thinking about where to move can make a 1-second warning survivable. The second concerns elevated and suspended structures in crowded public spaces. The walkways at the Hyatt were carrying 40 people on the second floor and nearly 20 on the fourth floor at the moment they gave way. They were already past the limit of what that connection could bear before the dancing began. Be cautious about crowding on balconies, suspended walkways, elevated viewing platforms, or any structure that is hanging rather than resting on solid supports, particularly in spaces where many people are already gathered. The warning signs that night were audible. Witnesses heard popping sounds from 30 meters away. Popping, cracking, or groaning from any floor, ceiling, or elevated structure in a building is not a normal sound. It is the structure communicating that something is wrong. Trust that sound and move away from it immediately. The third is about what to do if you cannot get out. If a structural collapse occurs and you find yourself on the ground and uninjured, your instinct will be to run toward the nearest visible exit. Resist the impulse to run through open floor space beneath any structure that is still moving or settling. Get to an interior wall or a structural column, which are typically the strongest points in a building, and get as low as possible. If you're in a crowd, the area directly beneath a suspended structure that has just partially failed is the most dangerous place to be. Move laterally, away from what is falling, rather than forward into the path of debris. If you're knocked down or buried, the single most important thing you can do is conserve yourself. Do not shout continuously. Shouting fills your lungs with dust and exhausts you faster than almost anything else. Instead, tap rhythmically on any hard surface near you, a pipe, a beam, a concrete slab. Rescue teams are trained to go silent periodically and listen for exactly this kind of signal. It is how Mark Williams was finally found beneath that concrete. Cover your mouth and nose with whatever fabric you have. Keep as still as you can. The space you are in, however small, contains enough air to sustain you far longer than you think, provided you do not panic and burn through it. And if water is rising around you, as it did in the Hyatt atrium when the sprinkler pipes burst, work to elevate yourself above it using any debris you can reach. Do not attempt to pull another trapped person free by force. Moving debris without understanding the load above, it can collapse what remains and kill both of you. Mark their location. Get clear. Direct rescuers to them the moment help arrives. 114 people went to a hotel lobby on a Friday evening in the summer of 1981 because they wanted to dance. They trusted that the building around them was safe, as any reasonable person trusts any building they walk into. That trust was broken, not by fate, not by an act of nature, but by a chain of human decisions made over years, each one small enough to seem inconsequential at the time, each one compounding the one before it, until the structure could no longer hold. The engineers who allowed that to happen lost their licenses. The companies that built it paid out settlements and walked away from further accountability. The victims and their families carried the weight of it for the rest of their lives. What remained, and what still remains today, are the names on that memorial column and the obligation not to let the world forget what those names mean and what they cost.